A brutal punch echoed across the arena, sending the fighter crashing to the mat. The crowd gasped as the referee dove in, checking whether the man could even move. But the victor was already parading around the cage, arms raised high, a wide grin stretched across his face. He strutted past the cameras, leaned over his fallen opponent, and shouted insults with arrogant confidence, utterly unapologetic. Some fans screamed with excitement, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Not far from the cage, in the front row, Jason Statham sat silently, his expression unreadable. No clapping, no reaction, only a pair of sharp, steady eyes locked directly on the fighter. The cocky fighter spotted him. Still breathing heavily and holding the mic, he pointed straight at. The cocky fighter spotted him. Still breathing heavily and holding the mic, he pointed straight at Sylvester Stallone. "You think you're tough in the movies? Step in here. Let's see if you're real." A hush spread across the crowd, thick and immediate. Then came the murmurs, the tension, and the chant. Some fans began cheering for Stallone, their voices rising with hope. Others simply waited, eyes locked on the man who remained motionless in his seat. Stallone sat still for a long, heavy second. Then, calm as ever, he stood up. His gaze was unwavering, shoulders steady, posture relaxed, as if he were soaking in the moment. He said nothing, not a word. He took one slow step toward the ring. The entire arena fell silent. Everyone knew everything was about to change. The T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas hummed with electric anticipation, the kind of night where you felt the ground throb beneath your shoes, where the crowd wasn't just waiting for a fight. They were waiting for history. Bright screens pulsed from every direction, drinks sloshed in plastic cups, and the scent of beer and buttery popcorn lingered in the air. It was a sold-out night, and every seat from the nosebleeds to the front row was filled with energy, with expectation. But none more than the crowd waiting for the main event, Tommy White Flash McConnell, the undefeated, unapologetic poster boy of modern combat sports. 29, media savvy, handsome in a Hollywood way, and blessed with a mean streak that fans either loved or loved to hate. He wasn't just a fighter. He was a brand, a spectacle, a product of an era where self-promotion and cockiness weren't flaws, but features. His opponent that night, however, was Leon Wallace, a veteran fighter from Baltimore, 43, tough as nails and quiet as a church pew. Leon had spent his whole life in gyms that smelled of sweat and old leather, fighting for respect more than fame. His record was solid, his style patient, but in an era of flash and social media highlight reels, Leon wasn't the kind of man promoters built pay-per-view cards around. He was the man you put in front of a rising star when you wanted the rising star to shine brighter. He'd been called a stepping stone more times than he could count. Tommy didn't make it subtle. "You're not going to see a fight," he said at the press conference 2 nights before. "You're going to see a burial. This guy's a fossil. 1998 called. It wants its black and white TV back." The room had erupted in laughter. The promoter didn't flinch. Some even clapped. Leon, sitting across the table, had just blinked once. No reaction. He was used to the noise by now. Back in the arena, the earlier fights had ended in a mix of submissions and TKOs, but the crowd was restless for the main show. Tommy's name flashed across the massive screen above the cage, and the roar that followed could have shaken the strip itself. He walked in like a rock star, flanked by 2 models, surrounded by flashing lights and pounding music. His team looked like a mix of rappers and personal trainers. He winked to the crowd, slapped a few hands, and then the cameras found something they hadn't expected. Sitting quietly in the front row, dressed in a charcoal gray jacket and open-collared shirt, was Sylvester Stallone. No entourage, no interview, no spotlight. Just him, older, face lined but still carved from granite, arms folded, gaze unmoving. People noticed quickly. Phones came out. The Jumbotron caught him in a single, still shot, but Stallone didn't react. He simply stared at the cage, as if he were watching something far more serious than a sporting event. Tommy noticed too. Just before stepping into the cage, he pointed. "Look who showed up." He smirked into the mic. "The man, the myth, the fossil. How's retirement, Rocky?" "Tell Apollo I said hi." The crowd erupted again. Some laughed, some cringed, and a few booed, unsure of how far was too far. Leon walked into the arena, with no music, no theatrics, just silence. His trainers wore shirts that read, "Baltimore Strong." He touched the mat, crossed his chest, and looked once, just once, toward Stallone. And then the bell rang. What followed was not a contest. It was a dismantling. Tommy was younger, faster, meaner. He danced, taunted, jabbed, hooked. He faked sympathy, grinned mid-punch, and made sure the cameras caught every smirk. Leon stayed on his feet for 2 rounds, but by the start of the third, his legs were gone. A clean right to the jaw, and he dropped like a stone. The ref dove in. Medics rushed out. Tommy didn't even look at Leon. He climbed the cage, flexed his arms, and turned to Stallone. "That your hero?" he shouted. "This your underdog story? Come on, Sly, don't just sit there. Come show 'em what's real." Then he grabbed the mic. "Let's be real," he barked, breathing hard, pacing inside the cage. "All those movies you loved as a kid? Rocky? Creed? That's not fighting. That's bedtime stories for grown men. This," he pointed to Leon, still unconscious, "this is what it really looks like." He paused, waited for the applause, then added, "Funny how every one of those so-called heroes looked like him, huh?" He motioned toward Leon again. "Always the black underdog. Always the miracle comeback. Not tonight. Not in Vegas. Tonight, the white guy wins." The arena fell quiet. Not in the way a crowd settles before a punch lands, but in the way a room holds its breath when something's been said that can't be unsaid. There was no applause. Not yet. Just murmurs. Stallone still hadn't moved. Tommy tossed the mic. "You got something to say, Sly? Or are you just another old man with stories and no spine?" That's when Stallone stood. Not fast, not dramatic. He rose slowly, like every bone mattered. Every movement was deliberate. He took off his jacket, folded it once, handed it to a young man in a staff vest standing nearby. The crowd was still quiet. Tommy's face lit up like Christmas morning. "You kidding me?" he shouted. "We got ourselves a sequel! Somebody get this man a mouth guard!" Security hesitated. The referee looked around, confused, but someone opened the cage door. And Stallone walked forward, not as an actor, not as a star, not even as Rocky Balboa. He walked like a man who had nothing left to prove, but wasn't about to let silence be mistaken for surrender. Tommy bounced in place, fists clenched, the grin still wide. "Let's go, Grandpa. Let's see if you're still made of something real." Stallone didn't answer. He just raised his hands, eyes never leaving Tommy. Then Tommy lunged. The first flurry came fast, left jab, right cross, spin, all speed, all anger. But none of it touched Stallone. He slipped, pivoted, stepped to the side. Not flashy, not fast, just perfectly timed. The crowd gasped. Tommy struck again. A hook, a kick, more taunting. "Hit me, damn it, hit me!" Still, Stallone waited, watched. Tommy came at him again, faster, more frantic. And that's when it happened. A slight overreach, a wrong weight shift, and Stallone saw it. One shot, a clean, sharp body blow, followed by a right hook that connected with Tommy's chin like a hammer on glass. Tommy dropped, no stumble, no drama, just down. The arena froze. For 3 long seconds it was so quiet, you could hear the soft hum of the lights overhead. Then someone screamed, then another, and then the place exploded. But Stallone didn't bask in it. He didn't raise his arms, didn't even look at the crowd. He stared at Tommy for a moment, then turned away, walked to the edge of the cage, and stepped out. He took his jacket back, nodded at the staffer, and walked toward the exit tunnel as if nothing unusual had just occurred. Behind him, chants erupted his name, loud and unified, rolling like thunder. Sly! 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 And Tommy, the man who thought the mic made him powerful, now sat dazed on the mat, blinking at the rafters. Still no words from Stallone. Just a walk, just the truth, unspoken. Backstage at T-Mobile Arena, the noise was distant, like thunder muffled behind heavy walls. Stallone walked down the concrete corridor with slow, steady steps, the chants still echoing faintly behind him. Security personnel and crew members lined the walls, half stunned, half reverent. Some clapped quietly as he passed. A young man in a UFC hoodie looked up from his phone, mouth slightly open. It's already viral, he whispered to no one. Stallone didn't glance up. His face remained unreadable, just as it had been inside the cage. One of the paramedics from the cage jogged past in the opposite direction, still heading back to the ring where Tommy McConnell sat on a stool. Jaw clenched, eyes glassy, a towel draped over his neck like a white flag. The commentator booth buzzed behind plexiglass panels above, voices overlapping as they tried to make sense of what had just unfolded. We may have just seen the most unexpected moment in combat sports history, one said. This wasn't a publicity stunt. That was real. Tommy sat upright now, but unsteady. He blinked under the bright lights and kept stealing glances at the tunnel where Stallone had disappeared. His team stood nearby, unsure whether to speak, unsure whether to spin it into a narrative or simply let it die quietly. A reporter from ESPN tried to approach, but was waved off. Tommy looked at the crowd, still chanting, still energized, but none of it was for him. He wasn't used to that kind of silence. He was used to owning the noise. Back in the hallway, Stallone paused near the locker rooms. He leaned against the wall, took a long breath, and looked down at his hands. No tremble, no sweat, just stillness. An old cut man named Ray Alvarez, who'd worked corners since the Tyson days, approached him with a bottled water and a smile that was more respect than cheer. That was something else, Sly, Ray said. Haven't seen that kind of composure since Ali fought Spinks. Stallone accepted the water, nodded once, and said quietly, It's not about the fight, Ray. It never was. Ray understood. Fighters always understood. Inside the arena, the crowd was still buzzing, conversations ricocheting between disbelief and awe. A woman in the third row turned to her husband, shaking her head. Did you see how he moved? He's 70-something, and that kid never touched him. Her husband replied, It wasn't just the punch. It was the way he waited, like he knew exactly when to let that boy tire himself out. People weren't just reacting to the knockout. They were reacting to something deeper, something older, the return of a kind of quiet strength they hadn't seen in a long time. At a nearby sports bar on Fremont Street, multiple screens replayed the moment over and over. No music, no commentary. Just that one movement. Tommy lunging, Stallone slipping left, then right, then delivering a perfectly timed hook that sent the younger man to the canvas. The room erupted every time it played. Strangers high-fiving like their hometown team had just won the Super Bowl. A grizzled bartender wiped down a counter and said, "That's how a man shuts up a fool without ever raising his voice." By the time Stallone exited the building through a side entrance, a small crowd had gathered. They weren't the screaming autograph-hunting fans from red carpet premieres. They were older, quieter, some veterans, some gym rats, a few kids holding up posters of Rocky. One man stepped forward, his hand trembling slightly, and said, "Thank you. That was needed." Stallone met his eyes and gave a small nod. No words, just the acknowledgement between men who'd lived enough to know how rare dignity had become. Back inside, Tommy McConnell finally spoke to his corner. "I didn't see it coming," he mumbled. "It wasn't fast. It was just, there." His coach knelt down, looked him in the eyes, and said, "He didn't beat you with speed. He beat you with timing. You gave him everything, and he gave you one thing. That's the difference." Tommy sat in silence, not angry, just stunned. The cameras kept their distance now. There was nothing left to spin. The noise had turned into a kind of vacuum, a vacuum of self-awareness. The media wasted no time. ESPN, Bleacher Report, TMZ, every outlet had the clip. Headlines flooded social platforms. Stallone floors McConnell without saying a word. Hollywood legend delivers real-life KO. Rocky steps into the cage and writes a new ending. One post, shared over 1 million times in 3 hours, simply read, "Respect is not won by shouting. It's earned in silence." The comments were a mix of awe, disbelief, and something else, gratitude. Not just for the punch, but for the presence, for what it represented. In Philadelphia, at a small boxing gym in Kensington, an old coach paused the heavy bag drill and gathered his young fighters around the monitor. "Watch this," he said, rewinding the clip. "Don't watch the punch. Watch the way he waits. Watch how he doesn't react. That's patience. That's control. That's what makes a real fighter." The kids leaned in. Even the ones who'd barely heard of Stallone knew they were seeing something important, something rare. Later that night, in a quiet suite overlooking the Vegas skyline, Stallone sat alone with a cup of black coffee. His hands rested on the table. The television was off. The noise had faded. It wasn't a moment of victory. It was reflection. He thought of all the men he'd trained with in his youth, the ones who never made it to the spotlight, the ones who fought hard, lost quietly, and went home with broken ribs and no headlines. He thought of Leon Wallace and how he'd stood alone in the cage, calm, dignified, before the match. And he thought of Tommy not with contempt, but with a strange kind of sorrow. There had been so many Tommies in his life. Boys who mistook noise for power, who confused rage with courage, who believed dominance had to be loud. He didn't hate them, he just felt sad for them, because the world had told them that masculinity was something to shout about instead of something to live with quietly. Meanwhile, Leon Wallace was recovering backstage. A medic shined a light in his eyes, checked his reflexes. "You're lucky," she said. "You took a hell of a hit." Leon smiled. "He needed the win. I already had mine." She didn't quite understand, but nodded anyway. Stallone had left the arena, but his presence hadn't. It lingered in the way the staff talked in hushed tones, in the way the reporters now asked softer questions, in the way some fans walked out a little more thoughtful than they walked in. Something had shifted. Maybe not forever, but at least for tonight. Tommy left last, hoodie up, head down, avoiding cameras. He didn't post, didn't tweet. He said nothing. But in the silence of his own hotel room, replaying the clip again and again, he saw something he hadn't seen before. Not the punch, not the fall, but the look on Stallone's face, calm, unwavering, utterly unaffected. A look he'd never mastered. A look he now realized he didn't understand. It wasn't rage. It wasn't revenge. It was responsibility. He turned off his phone, sat in the dark. For the first time in a long time, the boy who'd been trained to dominate sat still. The following morning, Las Vegas woke up to a different kind of buzz. This wasn't just about who won or lost a fight. It was about something else, something heavier, more personal. Local news anchors interrupted their morning traffic reports to replay the clip. Stallone rising slowly, stepping into the cage, and delivering one quiet answer to a night filled with noise. National outlets followed suit. The fight was no longer the story. The silence was. On Good Morning America, one panelist said, "We watched a legend show us that dignity doesn't age, that class doesn't retire." Social media spun in its usual storm, but buried within the memes and the headlines were real conversations. About respect, about aging, about how men carry themselves in a world obsessed with performance. Some younger fans argued it had been staged. "No way a 70-something-year-old man drops a champion like that," one user wrote. But those who had watched closely knew better. It wasn't brute force. It was timing. It was discipline. It was years of understanding the moment before it arrives. In a modest house outside Baltimore, Leon Wallace sat at his kitchen table, legs propped up on an old wooden chair, a bag of frozen peas resting against his jaw. His wife moved around the kitchen, pouring coffee, occasionally casting him a side glance that held a mix of concern and admiration. Leon tapped on his phone, reading message after message, texts from former opponents, young fighters, reporters who once ignored him. But the one that stood out was a short voicemail. "You didn't lose, Leon. You showed up with grace. That boy just didn't know what that looked like." The voice was unmistakable. Stallone. Leon smiled and leaned back in his chair. At UFC headquarters, conversations were quieter than usual. The marketing team debated how to handle the footage, whether to lean into it or let it rest. Some wanted to spin it into an exhibition opportunity, perhaps a crossover promotion. But Dana White, after watching the full fight replay again, simply said, "Leave it alone. That wasn't for us. That was for them." He didn't clarify who them meant, but no one asked. Back in Los Angeles, Stallone returned to his routine. Early mornings, light weights, black coffee, long walks along Mulholland. He turned down every interview. When The Tonight Show called, his assistant passed along the same message. No comment. He said what he needed to. But that didn't stop the world from asking questions. Across barbershops in Atlanta, diners in Detroit, firehouses in Chicago, and coffee shops in Des Moines, people asked each other, "Did you see it? Did you see the look in his eyes before the punch?" It became less about the knockout and more about the lesson, the power of restraint, the depth of patience, the meaning of earned silence. At a high school gym in Jersey City, a young fighter named Malik watched the clip for the 10th time. 16, quick fists, quicker mouth. He had always believed you had to be loud to be heard, that trash talk was part of the game. But that day, his coach didn't say a word. He just played the video, paused it right before the punch, and asked the room, "What do you see?" Malik leaned forward and said quietly, "He's not trying to win. He's just reminding." The coach nodded. That was it. Tommy McConnell stayed off the grid for a while. No press, no appearances. Rumor had it he'd gone to Big Bear to train in silence. No cameras. Just the mountains, a heavy bag, and his thoughts. When he finally resurfaced, it was through a simple post. A black and white photo of him lacing up gloves in an empty gym, captioned, "Learning, finally." The comment section, usually filled with trash talk and bravado, was different this time. "Good, it's never too late," one user wrote. "Humility looks good on you," said another. The tone had changed, and so had he. A few weeks later, an MMA podcast hosted by a pair of veterans invited Leon Wallace to speak. He didn't talk about the punch. He didn't even talk about the loss. Instead, he talked about what it meant to stand in the cage with dignity, even when the odds were stacked against you. "I knew I wasn't there to win," he said. "I was there to carry something, to show these young guys that you don't have to bark to have teeth, that your worth ain't measured by how many people are screaming your name. Sometimes it's measured by who's watching when you fall and what they see when you get back up." The episode went viral, not because it was loud, but because it was true. Eventually, someone asked Stallone if he would comment, just once, even off record. A close friend said he only offered a smile and a quiet reply. The kid had it coming. But he also had it in him to come back better. Then he went back to his garden. He'd been growing tomatoes. Said it helped him think. Months passed, and the world moved on, as it always does. New fights, new champions, new controversies. But for those who were there that night in Vegas, or those who watched it unfold from their couches, something remained. A stillness, a memory, a shift. The idea that maybe not everything had to be shouted to be heard. That maybe, in a world so obsessed with being seen, the most powerful thing a man could do was to be still and to wait and to strike only when it mattered. In the end, Tommy fought again. And he fought better. Not louder, better. He began to train with older fighters, spar with no cameras around, ask questions he once thought himself too great to ask. He stopped mocking his opponents. He started listening. Not everyone forgave him overnight, but people noticed. And that was enough. Leon Wallace never returned to the cage. He didn't need to. Instead, he opened a youth center in his neighborhood, a small gym where he trained kids who had too much energy and too little structure. He hung a single photo on the wall, Stallone standing in the cage just moments before the punch, his eyes calm and focused. Below it, in bold letters, the words, "Respect isn't loud." And Stallone? He faded back into his rhythm. He didn't change the world that night. He didn't have to. He just reminded it. Reminded a generation that strength doesn't always arrive with a roar. That silence, when chosen with wisdom, can be the sharpest blade. That legends don't always stand tallest when they win, but when they walk away, quietly, gracefully, and entirely on their own terms. So when people ask what happened that night in Vegas, those who know will say it wasn't a fight. It was a lesson. A reminder passed from one man to another in a world that had almost forgotten how to listen. And in that lesson, in that silence, something true was heard again. Something old, something good.